Greetings! In this video, we'll present the market of illegal drugs in order to give you a broader picture on the matter. First off, we'll explain the context of how drug traffic affects the world economically. Secondly, we'll explain Gary S. Becker's model, and finally, we'll compare how the legalization of drugs affect two different countries. Drug traffickers may have laundered around $1.6 trillion or 2.7% of global GDP in 2009, according to a report by UNODC. This figure is consistent with the 2 to 5% range established by the International Monetary Fund to estimate the scale of money laundering. Less than 1% of global illicit financial flows is currently being seized and frozen. Tracking the flows of illicit funds generated by drug trafficking and organized crime and analyzing how they are laundered through the world's financial systems remain daunting tasks, acknowledged Yuri Fedotov, Executive Director of UNODC. When it comes to the USA, Americans spent $109 billion on illegal drugs in 2010, according to a White House study, and while most of those drugs are imported from elsewhere, the cash Americans spend on them largely stays in the US. This is mostly because of the way value gets added to illegal drugs, as well as the stringent efforts governments make to intercept illicit drugs and the profits they produce. Money does go back to Latin America, but most of the profits involved in the drugs business actually stay here in the United States or in Europe, where the consumption happens. The reason for that is the big increase in the drugs value actually happens here. When it arrives in the States, it's worth, if we talk about cocaine for instance, it's worth about $20,000 per kilo. And finally, when it retails, it's worth more like $150,000 per kilo. And the reason for that is because the guys who do the stage and the chain are the ones who face the highest risk. They're the ones who take the shipment or perhaps a ton of cocaine, break it down into smaller portions of just a kilo or a few hundred grams, and ship it out to hundreds of contacts throughout the country.
This study by Gary S. Becker proposes two ways to reduce the demand and the consumption of drugs. It compares the effectiveness of legalizing the market of drugs and imposing a tax on the product with persecuting the producers and distributors of the drugs and imposing fees and sanctions for their illegal activities. As we will see, both options depend on the elasticity of demand. The first approach of Becker for reducing the consumption is to hunt down the producers of drugs and impose sanctions on them in order to reduce the illegal activity. But does it always work? We have to consider that if we have an elastic demand, the fees imposed would make a right effect because the price of the product would be increased, considering that the producers would raise the costs due to possible inconveniences. But on the contrary, if we have an inelastic demand, a raise of the costs due to inconveniences and a rise on the price would make no big impact on the consumption of the product.
The other approach to reduce drug consumption is by legalizing the drug market. Production and consumption of drugs not being a felony would mean no more cost restriction from governments and no more allocation of policemen, judges, and other resources used to pursue drug criminals. And now governments could impose a tax. According to the author, this approach won't work if the demand is very inelastic. The firms will be able to increase the price to pay the tax, and its cost of production would be reduced because of the fact that pursuing illegal drugs means a higher cost of production. And now, as the business is legit, this cost disappears. And as consumers will pay any price for the drugs, as they are not much sensible to any change of price, the demand will only experiment a small decrease. Otherwise, legalizing the drug market will work if the demand is elastic. The firm is forced to increase the price to be able to pay the taxes, resulting in the demand decreasing, as they are sensible to the change in price. It's in the government's interest to keep a reasonable tax, so the firms see that's more beneficial for them to keep the business legit. The only problem is that with big firms, they can absorb the tax, so the demand won't experiment much change. Gary S. Becker defends that governments should try to make the demand for drugs more elastic, so when the suppliers increase the price of consumption to pay the tax, the demand greatly decreases. With publicity about the consequences of using drugs, they can achieve it. He concludes that if the demand is inelastic, as it seems to be for the drug market, then higher prices lead to an increase in total spending on these illegal goods. So he thinks the solution is making the demand more elastic. We agree with him, but we think that he takes for granted that more publicity against drugs necessarily means less consumption. Also, we think that he should divide consumers are the same, nor all drugs have the same demand. That led us to think that
if Becker had divided the market, he would have realized that a legalization of a soft drug could have led to a decrease in the demand of hard drugs, just as it happened in Amsterdam. Also, Becker doesn't consider the option that even if the government legalizes the market and imposes a tax, it could appear cheaper ways to consume drugs that would be legal. This is what happened with tobacco a few years ago, with the appearance of rolling tobacco and the electric cigarette.
In the UK, under the Misuse of Drugs Act of 1971, illegal drugs were divided into Class A, B, and C. Penalties were most severe for Class A drugs like crack, cocaine, and heroin, and least severe for Class C drugs like khat and anabolic steroids. Producing or supplying Class A drugs can be punished with life imprisonment, while there is a 14-year maximum term for Class B and C. Possession is treated less severely, with maximum sentences of 7, 5, and 2 years for Class A, B, and C respectively. So, which European country has the most liberal drug laws? It is Portugal, although many people think it is the Netherlands. Portugal decriminalized drugs 14 years ago, and now hardly anyone dies from overdosing. Portugal decided to treat possession and use of small quantities of these drugs as a public health issue, not a criminal one. The country has 3 overdose deaths per million citizens, compared to the EU average of 17.3 and the 45.6 per million in the UK. The use of legal highs, like so-called synthetic marijuana, which is more dangerous than other drugs, is low in Portugal than in any other countries for which reliable data exist. This makes a lot of intuitive sense. Why bother with fake weed or dangerous designer drugs when you can get real drugs? Overall, it is demonstrated that not punishing severely the possession of drugs works in favor of public health and reducing drug consumption. We hope you get a better understanding of how the market of illegal drugs works nowadays. Thank you.